Some people live their entire lives on autopilot, going through the same thoughts, the same reactions, the same days, without ever questioning what's underneath. But when a few notice something specific, something subtle that doesn't quite fit, they start asking questions no one else asks. And once you begin asking those questions, nothing is ever the same again. It usually starts in the middle of life, not at the beginning. You're already moving, already functioning, already doing what you're supposed to do, and then a small sign appears, a moment of friction, a thought that doesn't resolve, a feeling that lingers longer than it should. It's not loud, but it's persistent. That's the moment this is about. Not answers, not beliefs, observation. Because when you notice that sign, the way you think begins to shift. You stop accepting things just because they're familiar. You start paying attention to how you think, not just what you think, and that single shift is enough to change the questions you ask, and eventually, the life you're living. It doesn't arrive with drama. There's no explosion, no clear moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. It comes quietly, almost politely, a feeling that something is off. Not wrong in a way you can explain, not painful enough to demand action, but present enough that you can't fully relax back into your old way of thinking. You might notice it in ordinary moments. Standing in line, driving a familiar road, sitting in a conversation you've had 100 times before. Everything looks the same, sounds the same, yet it doesn't land the same way inside you. It's like a word you've repeated too many times until it loses meaning. The structure is still there, but the sense behind it feels thin. At first you try to ignore it. You tell yourself you're just tired, or bored, or overthinking. You assume it will pass if you get some rest, stay busy, scroll a little longer, focus harder on what needs to be done. And for a while that works. The feeling fades into the background, but it doesn't disappear. It waits. Then one day, usually without warning, it surfaces again, stronger, sharper. You're doing something that used to feel normal, even comforting, and suddenly there's a gap between what you're doing and what you feel. A quiet question forms, not in words yet, but as tension. Why does this feel empty? Why am I doing this? Why does everyone seem so sure when I don't? This is the part most people struggle to describe, because it's not sadness, it's not fear, it's not dissatisfaction in the usual sense. It's more like a subtle misalignment, as if your inner compass has shifted slightly and the world hasn't caught up. You're still moving, still functioning, but something inside you knows you're not oriented the same way anymore. What makes it unsettling is that nothing obvious is wrong. Your life may look fine from the outside. Responsibilities are being met, conversations are happening, plans are in place. And yet, there's this quiet sense that you're missing something essential. Not an object, not a goal, but a layer of understanding. As if reality has a depth you haven't been taught how to see. You start noticing small cracks, moments where the script feels too rehearsed, opinions that sound borrowed, reactions that seem automatic, including your own. You catch yourself responding before you've actually chosen to, laughing where you're expected to laugh, agreeing without checking whether you truly agree. And that's when the discomfort sharpens, because it's no longer just about the world feeling strange. It's about realizing you might be participating in that strangeness. There's often a physical quality to this unease, a tightness in the chest, a restlessness that doesn't go away with movement, a sense of pressure behind the eyes, like you're on the verge of seeing something, but can't quite bring it into focus. Your body knows before your mind does. It reacts to the mismatch long before you can explain it. And still you hesitate to take it seriously, because taking it seriously would mean questioning things you've relied on for stability, beliefs, routines, identities. It would mean admitting that the map you've been using might not be complete. That's not a comfortable thought. So most people push the feeling down. They label it as a phase, a mood, a passing thought. But if you're honest, you know when it's not passing. You know when it keeps returning, tapping gently but persistently, asking for your attention. It shows up when you're alone, in the quiet spaces between distractions. It shows up when someone speaks with absolute certainty and something in you pulls back instead of leaning in. It shows up when answers feel too neat, too packaged, too final. This is where the unease becomes important, not because it gives you answers, but because it changes your relationship with certainty. You start to sense that what you've accepted as normal might just be familiar, that what you've called truth might be inherited, and that comfort and correctness are not the same thing. Nothing has collapsed yet. There's no revelation, no awakening moment, no dramatic shift, just a growing sensitivity, a quiet alertness, a sense that the surface of things no longer satisfies you the way it used to. You don't know what you're looking for, only that you're no longer fully convinced by what's in front of you. And here's the crucial part. This feeling doesn't make you special. It doesn't mean you're ahead of anyone. It simply means you've noticed something subtle that most people learn to ignore. And whether it grows or fades depends on what you do next. Because this discomfort is easy to silence. The world offers endless ways to drown it out. Noise, speed, productivity, entertainment, certainty. Most people choose those not because they're weak, but because listening to this feeling would require them to pause, to stay with the discomfort, to admit they don't know, and that's where the real divergence begins. Not in knowledge, not in intelligence, but in willingness. Willingness to sit with a quiet unease instead of rushing to erase it. Willingness to notice it without immediately explaining it away. Many people feel this same signal at some point in their lives. Very few allow it to stay long enough to change them. When that quiet discomfort appears, most people don't meet it with curiosity. They meet it with resistance. Not dramatic resistance, not a conscious decision to deny it, but a subtle turning away. A tightening. A reflex. The mind looks for the fastest way back to familiar ground. You can see how this happens everywhere. The moment something feels unsettling, attention shifts. A phone is picked up. A task is added to the day. A plan is made. Noise fills the space where a question was trying to form. And just like that, the discomfort is labeled as unimportant, irrational, or inconvenient. Something to be managed, not listened to. This isn't because people are unaware. It's because awareness carries a cost. To really feel that quiet unease means allowing the possibility that something in your life or in the way you see the world might need to change, and change threatens stability. Even when stability is built on assumptions that no longer fit, it still feels safer than the unknown. So the discomfort gets buried under responsibility, under productivity, under the idea of being realistic. Many people tell themselves they don't have time to think about these things. There are bills to pay, roles to maintain, expectations to meet. Questioning deeper layers of reality feels like a luxury, or worse, a risk. Something that could destabilize what they've worked so hard to build. There's also social pressure at play. Quiet questions don't always have a place in everyday conversation. If you voice them, people often respond with jokes, quick answers, or discomfort of their own. Not because your question is wrong, but because it touches something they've learned not to touch. So you learn, consciously or not, to keep it to yourself, to smooth over the edges, to stay fluent in the language of certainty. Over time, ignoring the discomfort becomes a habit. The body learns how to override its signals. The mind learns how to fill every empty moment. Silence becomes something to avoid, because in silence that unease returns, and it doesn't shout, it just waits. Many people confuse this waiting with weakness. They think if a feeling doesn't demand attention, it doesn't deserve it. But this discomfort isn't trying to dominate your life. It's trying to redirect it. And redirection is easy to dismiss when you're already moving at full speed. There's a deeper fear underneath all of this, the fear of disruption. If you stop and really listen, you might realize that some of your beliefs were never fully yours, that some of your goals were inherited, not chosen, that some of your certainties are held together by repetition, not understanding. That realization can feel dangerous, especially if your identity is built on those structures. So instead of questioning, many people double down. They become more certain, more opinionated, more attached to labels and explanations. Certainty becomes a shield, a way to keep the discomfort at a distance. If everything has an answer, there's no need to sit with questions. This is why the world often feels loud but shallow. There's constant commentary, constant conclusions, constant advice. But very little space to admit confusion, very little tolerance for not knowing. And the quiet discomfort thrives in that intolerance because it has nowhere to go. You might notice this pattern in yourself too. Moments where you almost followed the feeling, almost stayed with it, but then chose distraction instead. Not out of laziness, but out of self-protection. Because staying with it would have meant slowing down, feeling more, questioning assumptions that have kept you functional. And the irony is that the discomfort doesn't go away when it's ignored. It just changes shape. It becomes irritability, restlessness, a sense of being disconnected even while surrounded by people, a feeling of going through the motions while something essential remains untouched. Life continues, but it feels slightly flattened, like depth has been traded for efficiency. This is why so many people live on autopilot without realizing it, not because they're incapable of awareness, but because they've trained themselves not to notice certain signals. The system rewards speed, clarity, and confidence. It doesn't reward pause, uncertainty, or quiet observation, so those qualities get pushed aside. But here's the subtle shift that begins to happen when the discomfort isn't fully erased, when it's only partially ignored. You start noticing the effort it takes to keep everything smooth. You feel the tension behind the performance, the energy required to maintain the version of reality that doesn't quite fit anymore. You may catch yourself watching people, listening to conversations, sensing how often words are repeated without being examined, how reactions happen before reflection, how comfort is chosen over truth, not because truth is unwanted, but because it's demanding. And without making any decisions yet, without changing anything on the surface, something inside you begins to stay a little more awake, a little less willing to immediately silence that inner signal. You don't know where it's leading, only that ignoring it completely no longer feels honest. This is the point where observation starts to change, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle recalibration. You begin to see the patterns behind the avoidance, in others, in the culture, and slowly, uncomfortably, in yourself. At some point, without any clear decision, the way you look at things begins to shift. Not dramatically, you don't suddenly reject the world or step outside of it. You're still inside the same routines, the same conversations, the same environments, but your attention is no longer fully absorbed by them. It's as if you've taken half a step back, just enough to notice how things are being done. What once felt natural starts to feel arranged. Not fake in an obvious way, but rehearsed. You notice how often people speak in familiar phrases, how quickly opinions are delivered, how rarely anyone pauses to actually consider what they're saying. Conversations feel like they're following invisible scripts: question, response, joke, reaction, agreement, relief. It all flows smoothly, almost too smoothly. You begin to notice this, especially in yourself. Moments when words come out of your mouth before you've checked whether you truly mean them. Smiles that appear on cue, nods that signal understanding, even when something doesn't fully land. It's unsettling to realize how much of daily life runs on momentum rather than presence. This shift in observation doesn't make you judgmental. If anything, it makes you quieter, more attentive. You start listening not just to what people say, but how they say it. The timing, the tone, the speed. You notice how discomfort is often covered with humor, how certainty is used to avoid vulnerability, how silence is quickly filled before it can reveal anything awkward. The world hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has. You see patterns where you once saw randomness, repetition where you once saw choice. It begins to feel like many interactions are performances designed to maintain stability, not explore truth. And that realization carries a strange mix of clarity and discomfort. There's a particular moment when this really lands. You're in a situation that used to feel engaging, maybe even meaningful, and suddenly you feel like you're watching it from the outside. You see the cues, the expected responses, the predictable arc. You know what comes next before it happens. And when it does, it confirms what you sensed. The familiarity starts to feel hollow. This is where the question quietly forms. If so much of this is staged, how much of my life has been lived on cue? Not because you were forced, but because you learned what was rewarded, what kept things smooth, what earned approval. The realization isn't accusatory, it's sobering. You start noticing how rarely people truly look at each other, how often attention is divided, how conversations are used to reinforce identity rather than explore experience. It's not that anyone is intentionally pretending, it's that the structure encourages it. Roles are easier than presence. Scripts are safer than uncertainty. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. Even small moments reveal it. The way a room's energy shifts when a certain topic comes up. The way people adjust their tone depending on who's listening. The way disagreement is softened, redirected, or avoided altogether. It's subtle, but it's everywhere. What's most unsettling is recognizing your own participation. You catch yourself switching roles depending on context, being one version of yourself here, another version there, saying what fits rather than what's true. And you begin to ask, not with blame, but with curiosity, who is speaking right now, and why? This isn't about rejecting social life or withdrawing from others. It's about awareness, about seeing the mechanics behind the interaction. When you notice the mechanics, the illusion of spontaneity fades, and in that space, something else becomes possible. You may find yourself pausing more before responding, not because you're unsure, but because you're checking in. Does this response come from habit or from clarity? Does it serve connection or just comfort? These pauses can feel awkward at first. Silence stretches. People notice. You notice. There's also a sense of isolation that can arise here. Not loneliness exactly, but a feeling of being slightly out of sync, like you're watching a play you know by heart while everyone else is still immersed in the story. You don't feel superior. If anything, you feel exposed. Because once you see the stage, you can't fully disappear into the role anymore. And yet, something about this feels honest, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it makes things feel less effortless. You begin to value moments that feel unscripted, a genuine pause, a question without a ready answer, a response that takes a second to form. These moments feel alive in a way the others don't. As this way of observing settles in, another realization starts to surface. It's not just that others are following scripts, it's that you were too. And that raises a deeper, more personal question. If the performance is so widespread, if it feels so natural, how did you learn it? And what part of you learned to disappear inside it? There's a moment when observation turns inward, and that's where everything destabilizes. It's one thing to notice patterns in the world, in conversations, in social behavior. It's another thing entirely to realize that you weren't just watching the performance. You were part of it, fully immersed, responding on cue, believing it was your own choice. This realization doesn't arrive gently. It hits like a quiet fracture. Your thinking, which relied on a sense of autonomy and clarity, starts to wobble. You replay memories and see them differently. Decisions you once felt proud of now look guided. Reactions you believed were spontaneous feel conditioned, not forced, not manipulated in a dramatic sense, but shaped, repeated, reinforced. The word hypnotized feels uncomfortable because it suggests a loss of control, and no one likes to think of themselves that way. You want to believe you were awake, critical, independent, but as you look closer, you see how often you accepted ideas simply because they were familiar, how often you followed paths that were already marked, how rarely you stopped to ask where certain beliefs actually came from. This isn't about blame. There's no villain here. Hypnosis, in this sense, isn't a trick played on you. It's a slow, collective rhythm you learn to move with. Family norms, cultural expectations, definitions of success, ideas about what's normal, what's risky, what's acceptable. You absorbed them before you had the language to question them. The unsettling part is realizing how effective this was, how natural it felt. You didn't feel controlled, you felt responsible, productive, reasonable. You were rewarded for fitting in, for aligning, for not disrupting the flow. And over time, that alignment became invisible. It felt like identity. This is where thinking starts to break. Not because you lose intelligence, but because the structure your thoughts relied on begins to dissolve. The assumptions underneath your logic no longer feel solid. You catch yourself mid-thought and wonder, Is this conclusion mine or is it inherited? Is this fear based on experience or on repetition? There's often a wave of embarrassment that comes with this, a quiet shame for not seeing it sooner, for defending ideas you never examined, for dismissing questions that now feel obvious. But that shame doesn't last long if you stay with it. It gives way to something more useful: humility. You begin to see how easy it is for the mind to confuse familiarity with truth, how repetition creates confidence, how agreement feels like validation, and how rarely thinking actually begins from observation. Most of the time, it begins from accepted frames that narrow what you're even allowed to consider. This realization can feel disorienting. The mental shortcuts you relied on stop working. You can't lean on certainty the way you used to. When someone states an opinion with confidence, you don't immediately absorb it or reject it. You notice your own reaction first. The pull to agree, the urge to resist, the subtle emotional charge underneath. It's here that fear can surface. Not fear of the world, but fear of groundlessness. If so much of your thinking was guided, what remains when you step back? Who are you without the scripts, without the reflexes, without the ready-made explanations? And yet, alongside the fear, there's a strange sense of relief, because you're no longer pretending to be fully in control of something you don't understand. You're no longer defending a position just to feel stable. You're allowed to say, "I don't know," and actually mean it. This is also where many people turn back. The discomfort becomes too intense. It's easier to reattach to certainty than to stay in this open space. Certainty offers identity, belonging, direction. This open space offers none of that yet, just awareness. But if you stay, something subtle begins to happen. Your attention sharpens. You notice not just thoughts, but the moment they arise. You see how certain ideas come with emotional weight, while others pass through quietly. You start distinguishing between what feels imposed and what feels genuine. This doesn't make life simpler. It makes it more real. You stop assuming that clarity means answers. You begin to sense that clarity might mean seeing the limits of your own conditioning. And as this awareness deepens, another shift begins to form. If your thinking was influenced this deeply, if your perceptions were shaped without your consent, then the questions you ask matter more than you ever realized. Because questions are the first place where hypnosis loosens its grip. Once you begin to notice how deeply your thinking was shaped, the nature of your questions changes. You're no longer asking to confirm what you already believe. You're asking to see. And that shift, subtle as it is, creates friction, not because the questions are aggressive or provocative, but because they land in places that were never meant to be examined. You start with simple inquiries. Why do I believe this? When did I first accept this as true? What would happen if the opposite were also possible? These aren't confrontational questions. They're quiet, almost innocent. But they carry weight because they don't aim to preserve the structure. They aim to understand it. What surprises you is how often these questions are met with tension. You notice it in conversations, a slight change in posture, a defensive tone, a quick answer delivered with too much certainty. It becomes clear that some questions are welcome, while others are not. Questions that improve efficiency are encouraged. Questions that improve clarity are tolerated. But questions that challenge the foundation tend to be resisted. This resistance isn't always external. Sometimes it comes from within. You ask yourself something honest and immediately feel the urge to distract yourself, to scroll, to think about something else, to postpone. That reaction is revealing. It shows you where the conditioning is still active, where the mind protects certain beliefs not because they're true, but because they're familiar. When you do voice these questions aloud, you begin to see how carefully most social systems are designed to avoid them. In workplaces, families, even friendships, there are unspoken agreements about what not to question. Not because people are hiding something, but because questioning certain assumptions threatens the roles everyone depends on. You might ask why success is defined a certain way and feel the room go quiet. You might question a commonly held belief and notice people subtly distancing themselves, not angrily, politely, as if you've broken an unspoken rule. And in a way, you have. You've stepped outside the shared trance that keeps things predictable. This can be lonely, not because you're pushing people away, but because the space you're entering doesn't have many companions. Most people don't mind answers being wrong. What they mind is questions that don't allow them to stay comfortable. The right questions don't offer immediate relief. They create openness, uncertainty, and that's hard to sustain. You also begin to see how often questions are used to control rather than explore. Leading questions, framed questions, questions that already contain the desired answer. Once you see this, it's hard to ignore. You notice how narratives are protected not by force, but by steering curiosity away from sensitive areas. Asking differently doesn't make you smarter, it makes you more exposed. You become aware of how much of your previous confidence was borrowed from shared assumptions. Without those assumptions, you stand on less solid ground, but that ground, while unstable, is more honest. You start to feel the difference between questions that seek closure and questions that invite observation. Closure feels safe. Observation feels risky. Observation doesn't promise resolution. It asks you to stay present with complexity, to resist the urge to simplify too quickly. This is where questions begin to act like pressure points, not because they attack, but because they reveal tension that was already there. You realize that many beliefs are held together by avoidance. They function only as long as certain questions aren't asked. Once those questions surface, the belief has to either evolve or harden. You may notice people responding by becoming more rigid, more certain, more attached to their position. This isn't strength, it's defense. And recognizing that helps you soften. You stop expecting understanding. You stop trying to convince. You focus instead on staying honest with your own observation. At the same time, you become more careful with your own questions. You see how easy it is to ask in a way that provokes rather than reveals. You learn to slow down, to ask from curiosity rather than frustration, to notice your own emotional charge before speaking. This refinement doesn't make the questions less powerful. It makes them more precise. You're no longer interested in winning arguments, you're interested in seeing clearly. And that clarity often comes with consequences. Situations that once felt easy begin to feel strained. Relationships subtly shift. Certain conversations no longer flow the way they used to. Not because something is wrong, but because you're no longer playing the same game. You're not offering the same cues. You're not reinforcing the same patterns. And without making any declarations, without drawing any lines, you start to sense that asking the right questions doesn't just change how you think. It changes how the world responds to you. As your questions become more precise and less automatic, your attention starts to reorganize itself. You're not looking for signs and you're not trying to interpret everything as meaningful. But somehow, things begin to stand out that never did before. Details that used to blur into the background now linger a little longer. You notice repetitions, timing, small alignments that feel too consistent to dismiss, yet too subtle to explain away. This doesn't feel mystical in the way people often describe it. It feels observational, like realizing you've been walking through the same neighborhood for years without ever noticing the street names. Nothing new has appeared. What's changed is your sensitivity, your willingness to register what's already there. You might notice how certain ideas keep resurfacing in different forms. A phrase you hear in a conversation echoes something you read earlier that day. A problem you've been quietly sitting with appears mirrored in an unexpected place, not as an answer, but as a reflection. These moments don't shout, they don't demand interpretation, they simply register. At first, you're cautious. You don't want to fall into projection, seeing meaning where there is none. So you slow down. You observe without concluding. You notice your own reactions before assigning significance. And in doing so, you begin to sense the difference between imagination and pattern recognition. What stands out most isn't dramatic coincidence, but consistency. Certain themes keep appearing around you. Certain situations repeat with slight variations. Certain choices seem to circle back until you address them differently. It starts to feel less like randomness and more like feedback. This is where the idea of symbols begins to make sense, not as hidden messages, but as compressions of information. A symbol isn't something magical. It's something that carries more meaning than its surface suggests, depending on how closely you're paying attention. When your observation sharpens, ordinary events begin to carry layered significance. You notice how your internal state seems to affect what you register externally. When you're distracted, the world feels flat and repetitive. When you're attentive, it feels textured, responsive, not in a way that centers you as special, but in a way that highlights relationship. You're no longer separate from what you're observing. You're part of the exchange. This can feel unsettling because it challenges the idea that reality is entirely fixed and neutral. You begin to see how perception filters experience, how attention selects meaning, how what you notice shapes what becomes relevant. The world hasn't turned symbolic overnight. You've simply stopped filtering it so aggressively. There's also a humbling aspect to this. You realize how much you missed before, how much information you dismissed because it didn't fit your expectations. You see now that attention isn't passive, it's active, it participates. And that realization carries responsibility. You become more careful about what you focus on, not in a rigid way, but in an honest one. You notice how easily fear narrows perception, how easily desire distorts interpretation. You catch yourself wanting certain patterns to mean something specific, and you pause. You let the observation remain open. Over time, this openness creates a strange sense of dialogue with life. Not a conversation with words, but with timing and response. You take a step and something shifts. You hesitate and something repeats. It's not guidance in the traditional sense. It's consequence made visible. You also notice how symbols are deeply personal. What stands out to you might mean nothing to someone else. That doesn't make it imaginary. It makes it contextual. Meaning arises at the intersection of attention and experience. And no two intersections are identical. This awareness doesn't pull you away from reality. It grounds you in it. You're less interested in abstract explanations and more interested in lived observation. You don't rush to interpret. You register, you feel, you wait. Patterns reveal themselves over time, not in flashes. At the same time, you become aware of how easy it would be to misuse this sensitivity, to inflate meaning, to build narratives too quickly. That awareness keeps you balanced. You stay close to what's observable, what repeats, what changes when you change. And slowly, almost without realizing it, your sense of participation deepens. You no longer feel like a passive observer watching symbols appear. You feel like your way of engaging with the world is part of the pattern itself. What you ask, what you notice, what you ignore, all seem to ripple outward. This is where something subtle begins to shift again. Because once you recognize that attention reveals patterns, you start to wonder what happens when attention itself changes, and whether the world responds not just to what you see, but to how you see it. Once your attention shifts and your questions change, something unexpected happens. It's not dramatic and it's not immediate, but it's consistent. The world doesn't stay neutral. Situations begin to respond differently, as if the field you're moving through has become more sensitive to your presence, not because reality is bending to your will, but because you're no longer interacting with it in the same way. You notice this first in small, almost dismissible moments. A conversation that used to feel predictable suddenly goes in an unexpected direction. A situation you've avoided for years resurfaces, but this time it asks something different from you. Opportunities appear, not as rewards, but as tests. They require clarity instead of speed, honesty instead of performance. At first, this can feel like resistance. Things that used to work no longer work as smoothly. Old strategies lose their effectiveness. Provisional responses fall flat. You try to lean on habits that once carried you through, and they don't land the same way. It's tempting to interpret this as things going wrong. But if you look closely, it's not collapse, it's exposure. When you change the kind of questions you ask, you stop reinforcing the same patterns. And patterns that aren't reinforced begin to weaken. This creates friction, especially in systems that rely on predictability. People may respond differently to you. Some become curious, others become distant. Not because you're doing anything overtly different, but because you're no longer offering the same cues. You might notice that situations now seem to demand more presence from you. They don't resolve themselves automatically. You can't default to what's expected. You have to choose. And choice, when it's real, carries weight. It requires attention. It asks you to be involved. There's also a strange sense of being tested, not by some external force, but by life itself. You're placed in moments that reflect your questions back to you. If you ask about honesty, you encounter situations that reveal where you're still avoiding it. If you ask about freedom, you meet the limits you've accepted without noticing. The questions don't produce answers as concepts, they produce experiences. This can be uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of distance. You can no longer think your way out of situations. You have to engage with them. And engagement exposes you. You see your own inconsistencies more clearly. You notice where your actions lag behind your understanding. What's important to see here is that the world isn't reacting to you as a person. It's reacting to your mode of engagement. When you were on autopilot, life met you with autopilot responses. When you begin to observe and question, life responds with complexity. Not to challenge you, but to match you. This responsiveness makes reality feel more alive. Less like a fixed backdrop and more like a dynamic process. You start to sense that meaning isn't something you extract from life. It's something that emerges through interaction. The way you ask shapes the way you receive. You also become more aware of timing. Things don't happen when you want them to. They happen when you're able to meet them. When your questions are shallow, the responses are shallow. When your questions deepen, the responses become layered. Not clearer, but richer. There's a temptation here to feel special, to believe you've unlocked some hidden mechanism, but that temptation fades quickly if you're paying attention. Because the responsiveness cuts both ways. It doesn't just open doors, it closes them. It removes paths that no longer align with your questions, and that can feel like loss. Certain relationships may become strained. Certain ambitions lose their pull. Certain distractions stop working. This isn't punishment, it's coherence. When your inner orientation shifts, outer arrangements adjust, not always gently. You may find yourself in situations that feel more demanding than before. They ask for patience, discernment, courage. The easy way out becomes less available, not because it's forbidden, but because it no longer satisfies the questions you're living with. And slowly you begin to realize that answers are not static things waiting to be found. They are shaped by the quality of attention you bring. The world doesn't hand you meaning, it reflects your inquiry. This realization brings you closer to something essential. Not more knowledge, but more sensitivity. You start to sense that the real power isn't in controlling outcomes, but in refining observation. Because the better you observe, the more accurately you can respond. At some point, it becomes clear that gathering more information isn't giving you what you're looking for. You've read enough. You've listened to enough explanations. You've heard enough opinions, theories, and frameworks to last a lifetime. And yet, clarity didn't come from accumulation. It came from refinement. You begin to see that most confusion isn't caused by lack of knowledge. It's caused by unexamined perception. The mind rushes to label, interpret, and conclude long before observation has finished its work. Knowing more often just means having more material to reinforce old patterns. Observation, on the other hand, asks something different of you. It requires patience. It asks you to slow the process down enough to notice what's actually happening, not what you expect to happen. It's less about adding and more about subtracting, less about answers and more about attention. You notice how quickly the mind wants to move from experience to explanation. Something happens, and within seconds, there's a story about it, a reason, a judgment, a plan. Observation interrupts that reflex. It creates a small gap between stimulus and response. And inside that gap, something changes. That gap is where choice lives. Not the dramatic kind of choice, but the subtle kind. The choice to stay with a feeling instead of escaping it. The choice to listen fully instead of preparing a reply. The choice to notice your own assumptions before acting on them. You realize that most people don't lack intelligence. They lack space. Their attention is crowded with conclusions. There's no room left for curiosity. Observation clears space. It doesn't replace one belief with another. It creates room for reality to show itself without being immediately categorized. As this becomes clearer, you start trusting observation more than explanation. You don't rush to understand what something means. You watch how it unfolds, You notice what repeats, what intensifies, what fades when you stop feeding it. Meaning reveals itself through consistency, not through force. You also begin to see how observation is active, not passive. It shapes what you're able to perceive. When your attention is scattered, reality feels fragmented. When your attention is steady, patterns emerge naturally. Not because you're searching for them, but because you're present enough to register them. This changes how you relate to problems. Instead of immediately trying to solve them, you observe them. You notice when they arise, what triggers them, how your body responds, what thoughts accompany them. Often the problem begins to shift, simply because it's being seen clearly. Not fixed, but understood. There's a humility that comes with this. You stop assuming that the first interpretation is the right one. You accept that your perspective is partial, that your view is shaped by mood, history, expectation. Observation includes observing yourself. Your reactions become data, not directives. You notice how often emotions are mistaken for facts, how often urgency is mistaken for importance. Observation slows those confusions down. It allows emotions to be felt without immediately being acted upon. That alone changes everything. This doesn't make life quieter. It makes it more precise. You feel things more clearly, but they don't overwhelm you as easily. You see complexity without needing to simplify it too quickly. You can hold opposing possibilities without forcing resolution. As observation deepens, you become less interested in convincing others. You're more interested in seeing accurately. You recognize that arguments often arise from poor observation on both sides. When observation improves, many conflicts dissolve on their own. You also see how observation dissolves false certainty, not by replacing it with doubt, but by revealing its limits. You're no longer seduced by confident explanations that ignore nuance. You look for coherence instead, alignment between words, actions, and outcomes. This shift is subtle, but it has consequences. You respond differently. You speak differently. You move through situations with less reactivity, and because of that, situations respond differently to you, not because you're controlling them, but because you're meeting them where they actually are. Over time, you start to sense that observation is not just a skill, it's a posture, a way of being in contact with reality without trying to dominate it. And the more you live from that posture, the more obvious something becomes. What once felt complex starts to feel simple, not because you understand more, but because you see more clearly. And in that clarity, you begin to realize that observation itself is what's been quietly shaping every change along the way. There comes a point when the things that once felt unsettling, confusing, or even uncomfortable start to feel obvious. Not because they've changed, but because you have. The strangeness dissolves, and in its place there's a quiet recognition, a sense of course it works this way. Of course it always has. You remember when noticing patterns felt risky, like you might be imagining things. Now it feels grounded. You're no longer trying to prove anything to yourself. You don't need to label what you're seeing. You simply recognize it. The way conversations loop, the way situations repeat until they're met differently, the way attention alters experience. None of this feels mystical anymore. It feels practical. What's surprising is how invisible this all was before. You move through familiar places and realize you're seeing them for the first time, not visually, but relationally. You notice how environments shape behavior, how tone sets direction, how small cues guide large outcomes. And once you see this, you can't go back to seeing the world as random or flat. There's no rush to explain this to others. You've learned that explanation often gets in the way. You don't feel superior or awakened. If anything, you feel simpler, more grounded, less compelled to perform certainty. You understand now that clarity doesn't announce itself. It settles. You catch yourself smiling at moments that used to frustrate you, a predictable reaction, a familiar argument, a repeated mistake. Not because you enjoy them, but because you recognize the pattern before getting pulled into it. Recognition creates space. Space creates choice. This is where the phrase, "you can't unsee it," becomes real. It's not dramatic, it's practical. You can't unknow how attention shapes experience. You can't ignore how often people speak from habit rather than presence. You can't fully participate in autopilot once you've felt what it's like to step out of it. There's also a subtle grief that comes with this clarity. You see how long you lived without noticing, how much energy went into maintaining illusions you didn't choose consciously. You see it in others too, and that can be tender. You understand why people cling to certainty. You remember how safe it once felt. This understanding softens you. You become less reactive, less eager to correct or confront. You know that seeing can't be forced. It happens when someone is ready to stay with discomfort long enough for clarity to form. Until then, no amount of explanation will help. What once felt strange now feels woven into everything. Silence carries information. Timing feels intentional. Repetition feels instructive. Not as commands, but as signals. You don't need to interpret them constantly. You simply register them. They inform your next step without demanding a story. You also notice how your own behavior has changed without effort. You pause more. You listen longer. You speak with more precision. Not because you're trying to be mindful, but because reactivity no longer feels natural. It feels inefficient. You've seen what happens when attention is scattered, and you prefer coherence. This doesn't mean life becomes easier. It becomes clearer. Challenges still arise. Uncertainty still exists. But you're not fighting reality anymore. You're engaging with it. You're not asking how to control outcomes. You're asking how to respond accurately. And because of that, your relationship with the unknown changes. You're less threatened by it. You don't rush to close questions. You allow them to remain open long enough to teach you something. You trust observation more than prediction. The most interesting part is how normal all of this feels now. There's no sense of arrival, no finish line, just a steady, quiet awareness that keeps refining itself. You don't feel like you've gained something extraordinary. You feel like you've stopped missing what was always there. And once that happens, there's no clean way to go back. Not because you've outgrown anything, but because pretending not to see would require more effort than honesty. The world hasn't become more mysterious or more obvious. It's become more transparent. You move forward knowing that this way of seeing isn't something you turn on and off. It's something that continues to shape how you meet each moment. And every time you notice yourself about to fall back into old patterns, the clarity is already there, quietly reminding you that you've seen too much to fully disappear again. When you notice this, something fundamental shifts. Not all at once, not in a way you can point to on a calendar, but steadily. Your mind stops rushing to fill every gap. Your life stops feeling like something that just happens to you, and you stop seeing yourself as separate from what you experience. You don't become certain. You become attentive. You don't gain control. You gain clarity. And that clarity changes how you move, how you decide, how you relate to people and to yourself. The same world is still here, but you meet it differently. And that difference compounds over time. If this resonated, it's likely because you were already noticing something before this ever started. This just gave it language, or permission. If you reach this point, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. I'm paying attention now. And if this way of seeing feels useful to you, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen and keep going. If you want more content like this, that's where it continues.